Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Devin. I'm with the Brewster Ladies Library. This program is sponsored by the Brewster Ladies Library Association and its members. Tonight, we're with Peggy Jablonski, creator of the Cape Cod Camino Way, for a walk virtually through every town on Cape Cod to look at historical issues from the current lens of social justice. We'll learn about women and people of color who had an impact on Cape Cod, connect historical events, trends, and people to current issues of today. This will be an interactive, inspirational learning experience to expand your awareness of the people, places, and stories right around you. And if you missed it, we are going to be taking questions at the end, but feel free to put them in the chat box if you're afraid of forgetting them as the presentation continues. So I'm going to turn it over to Peggy. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Devin. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us. And so I'm going to start by sharing my screen. And so you can see, whoops, this is what always happens when you try to do these things. So somehow, there we go. Okay. So thank you for joining us tonight. I'm going to take us on an invigorating walk around Cape Cod virtually. And so you're going to get to touch all the major towns and learn a little bit about some of the people, places, and stories that we don't usually hear about or weren't taught about in high school or grade school. And I like to connect these things with the exploration of racial and social justice. That just tells you who I am. I'm a background in higher ed and still work in education. I lead some wellness retreats and workshops. And I started this project called the Cape Cod Camino Way in 2020, when we had this convergence of what I call two pandemics. It was an impact of the murders of many Black and brown people that year, the most notable being George Floyd, and the pandemic, COVID, hitting us and shutting us down so we couldn't travel anywhere. So I instead have always wanted to walk the Camino Way, which is an ancient pilgrimage route in Spain, starts in France, Portugal, other places. And so I decided that every week in the summer of 2020, on Wednesday, I would walk from 12 to 15 miles of the Cape. And then I plugged them all together over the summer. And what I did each week was look for people, places, and stories that needed to come to light, that especially touched issues of social justice. And so you'll see here, this is an outline of Cape Cod. Each clamshell, with the shell, is a marker of the Camino Way in Spain. So I chose the Wampanoag shell, the quahog, and I started at the canal. And you can see each walk we're going to touch today. And I started 4th of July weekend and ended up September, Labor Day weekend in Provincetown. And so each walk had a theme, and it was based on what from history and contemporary culture needed to be explored in each walk. So here we go. The first walk really looked at, it was 4th of July weekend, the day before the 4th. And so what I decided to do was explore the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And I went back and read them. I was a history major in college. I'm sure I read them at some point. But at no point do I remember reading in the Declaration of Independence that, quote, King George has excited domestic insurrections among us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, comma, the merciless Indian savages, comma, and then it goes on. I never remembered in the Declaration of Independence that it had those words. I knew that in the Constitution of the United States that enslaved people were counted as 2/3 of a human, and that set up the political dynamic that we still are living with today in the Electoral College, and that the South's power in the electoral system, it was outsized by that accommodation. So we started walking. If you've never walked both sides of the canal in the same day when it's 80 degrees out, it can be quite a challenge. But we walked and stopped at the Uptuxis Trading Post and Museum, which I knew nothing about because I hadn't walked on that side of the canal. Sorry, let me go back. In a long time. And this is a replica of where the pilgrims and descendants thereof used to trade with the native population. It also was our first, if you think back, 2020 was the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower and the Pilgrim experience coming to the US. And so throughout the whole summer, I joke that I was followed by the Pilgrims. Everywhere I went on Cape Cod, there was something to look at. And then that caused me to dig deeper about, okay, well, what was the Wampanoag experience with that? So you're going to hear some of that juxtaposition going on. The next walk, I focused on women and people of color in science. BIPOC means Black, Indigenous people of color. And so over in Woods Hole, I walked from Falmouth to Woods Hole, some on the Shining Sea bike path, but some on the roads. And I interviewed women in science from Woods Hole, from NOAA, and we had some of those women walk with us. Their picture is there in front of the statue of Kathy Lee Bates on the Falmouth Green. And I started taking a look at, okay, what do we hear when we hear the America the Beautiful song? And why did Kathy Lee Bates write it? And that's a statue of a woman. How many statues of women exist on Cape Cod? I didn't know. I found 3 in my walks. One here, one at the end in Falmouth, that I'll talk about in a minute. So Kathy Lee Bates was a professor at Wellesley College. America the Beautiful was first written as a poem in 1893 as she was on a train going across country. And the final stanza of the poem is this: America, America, God shed his grace on thee, till nobler men keep once again thy whiter jubilee. We had just had the murder of George Floyd. We had just experienced the University of Virginia, Charlottesville killing that happened there. We had just experienced the Mother Emanuel murders in Charleston, of a white man killing Black parishioners as they prayed. So I couldn't believe that the last stanza said that, to restore thy whiter jubilee. That stanza was eliminated from when the song got created. Again, why? I just needed to explore that more. The most heartening thing, though, that happened on this walk was that a couple of girls from Falmouth High School joined us and were inspired by the women scientists who were with us to continue to explore their interests in math and science, even though they thought they weren't being as encouraged maybe in some of the programs they had been in so far. So that was something I tried to do on all my walks, was to connect people with each other. We would talk on the walks, we would ask each other questions, we would share stories, and that made it more interactive for everyone. Over the course of that summer, 43 different people walked with me, and one person walked for the whole summer with me. So the third walk went from Mashpee through Osterville, Centerville, Marston Mills, and Hyannis. This was a tough walk. If you've never walked on Route 28 through Centerville and Marston Mills and Hyannis, do not do it. Some places don't even have wide sidewalks. So that made me think about accessibility issues as a social justice issue on Cape Cod. How do people get around on many of our major thoroughfares? So we started here at the Wampanoag Museum, which that photo on the top is the backyard. So the museums were not open, but I was able to go to their websites and find out a ton of information about the Wampanoag people who in 2020, if you remember, they were still fighting with our federal government for the appropriate federal recognition of the tribe. They were in federal court in 2020 over that issue. And it just was so disheartening to me that 400 years after the Pilgrims came here, the Native Americans who lived here were still fighting for appropriate recognition. We also, this walk was hard because members of my family, who you can see in the bottom photo, you can see that there's several people of color in that photo. My sister-in-law is from Trinidad. We were racially profiled as a group on this walk. In Centerville or Osterville, we had stopped for a break to get some water. And we had some maintenance guys come up to us and ask us what we were doing there. I didn't hear that. Some others did. And my brother told them we were on a walk. 3 of us were in t-shirts all together with Cape Cod Camino Way. And my brother asked me, do you just realize what happened to us? And I said, no, I don't. Please explain. And he said, we were just racially profiled because we don't look like we belong here. And this is what happens to my family all the time. My sister-in-law has been stopped 3 times by the police. She has a doctorate in theoretical math and teaches at the Coast Guard Academy. She should not have to be subjected to that. So what happened after that profiling incident is it opened up a conversation for about 10 of us who were walking that day about who's safe in what spaces on Cape Cod and who is not. And then we went to a fabulous museum, the Zion Union Heritage Museum on North Street in Hyannis, that showcases art. Oh, I'm sorry, there's my family. Sorry about that. So you can see that several of us were in t-shirts that looked the same. So I'm not sure why they would ask us what we were doing there. So this is the Zion Union Heritage Museum that has about 35 of these icons of Black people from the United States. Historical, goes all the way back to Crispus Attucks, who was one of the 3 killed in the Boston Massacre at the beginning of the American Revolution, up through President Obama was her latest one. And we had a presentation there. I should just honor John Reed, who was the president of the NAACP. He came in and opened the museum for us that day. And it really was an extraordinary presentation by the artists who created this artwork for us. The 4th walk was all up the 6A side. And that's me sitting in front of the statue of Mercy Otis Warren. For those of you who haven't heard about Mercy, Mercy is the most famous woman of the American Revolution that none of us were taught about in grammar school or high school. Excuse me. We learned about Betsy Ross sewing a flag, but Mercy interacted with John Adams, who encouraged her to use her voice in the political process. Her husband, Mercy's husband, was the quartermaster for George Washington. So she got to interact with John Hancock, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and Patrick Henry. And why she's so important is that she's kind of like the Rachel Maddow of today. She was a political commentator, but she was never allowed to publish much in her own voice because women back in the day didn't have access to publishing their own writings. But what she did do is, after the Constitution of the United States was written, it was sent out to all the states, and it took about a year for it to be read and ratified by many of the states. And when Mercy read the Constitution, she realized that there was no enumeration of individual protection, i.e., the Bill of Rights. Mercy drafted that and sent it off to people like Madison, Jefferson, etc. To this day, we still don't appropriately credit Mercy Otis Warren with her influence on the Bill of Rights in our country. As we walked, we would see lots of signs. It was an election year. And just as now, 2024 is a very, very important election year. So we discussed some of the issues going on in the election. And we also found, this is one of the really wonderful spots on 6A in Dennis. It's right on the, where Scargo Lake is. But I encourage you to go down and check out the burial ground of the Nobscussets. Again, a connection to the part of the Wampanoag peoples. Okay, our next walk kind of crisscrossed the Cape and went from Harwich, through Harwich and Chatham. And we stopped at the Atwood Museum, which that photo's down below. They had just commissioned one of the Whedons to develop a Wetu for them. This is the Wetu that the Native Americans lived in on many of our lands. They did not live in teepees, as we see on some of our town seals and other such pictures. And we focused on healthcare across Cape Cod, especially the impact of COVID that having on people of color. And we explored the Cape Verdean influence on Cape Cod, because a lot of the cranberry industry that we were walking by in Harwich, the cranberry bogs, was developed by the Cape Verdeans. So that was part of our walk. We had a couple of friends with us that day. Anytime I saw a cemetery, we explored who was in the cemeteries. This is a really interesting photo I want you to take a look at. See what you see in this photo. This is from World War II on the wall in the Atwood Museum in Chatham. What is significant is that most of us, myself included, have never seen a Black person depicted as Rosie the Riveter. That's her. She worked on the same equipment that white men did. And so that was really interesting to me. She just literally jumped off the wall at me when I saw her that day. And I mention that because I think once we start looking for things, they're more obvious to us. At least that's what happened from my experience of all these walks. So the next walk came through my hometown of Brewster, and many of you are from Brewster. And we walked Brewster, Orleans to Eastham. And in this walk, we focused on Brewster's connection as the sea captain town, and how many of our captains were involved in trading with either the South, going to North Carolina, South Carolina, New Orleans, Cuba, Barbados, and Haiti, etc., and who went over to Africa. And so I encourage people to take a look at the Brewster Historical Society work that they've been doing to document some of the explorations that were going on over with Africa. According to the society, there is no definitive proof that any sea captain in Brewster engaged in the slave trade, meaning taking enslaved people from Africa to the Caribbean or the south of this country. but that work is still ongoing. And there's a lot of important connections that can be made between our Brewster sea captains and the institution of slavery in the South. And you can see it in our headstones, in our graveyards, where several of our captains were buried in places like Cuba or Barbados, etc. That's the Brewster Historical Society there. You can see like this one died in Africa. And so I understand that there's no direct proof yet. However, thinking that the reason we had such a robust economy was because we engaged in the trade, bringing, for example, cotton back here, or sugarcane that was turned into the drink of the day, rum, etc. That's just an example of some of our sea captains' homes. And then we stopped up in Fort Hill in Eastham, where there's a fabulous exhibit there out in Fort Hill of the Native Americans who lived there. And again, it's an example of the We-Toos. And thinking about how explorers from European countries came right into our shores on both sides of Cape Cod. British, Portuguese, Samuel de Champlain, in this case, into Fort Hill. All right, our next walk, we really focused on the cultural influences of people of color, authors, poets, musicians. I asked each person walking, and you see we had a group of about 10 people there that week, to bring a person of color or a woman writer or artist, songwriter. And so we exchanged all of those over the course of the walk. It was wonderful. A lot of, there were some young people with us again this day. And so we also took a look at, because we went through Wellfleet, here's the seal of the town of Wellfleet. And I think about 4 or 5 of our seals on Cape Cod include the picture of a Mayflower. This one, it shows a group of pretty jovial, I interpret them as jovial pilgrims, saying hello to the Native Americans on the shore. And that represents the shallop, or the little boat that they came ashore in Eastham. And here's our Native Americans, who none of them wore headdresses as are portrayed in this seal. And this might be a whale that they all partook in. But what really happened here is, if you go to Eastham to First Encounter Beach, you'll see where the pilgrims did come ashore, and there was a skirmish and nobody was killed, but they weren't really welcomed the way it's portrayed here, because the pilgrims got off in Provincetown, as you may or may not know, and they wandered around, they traipsed around through P-Town, Truro, Wellfleet, down to Eastham, disturbing Native American graves, robbing their campsites of things like pots to cook in, etc. But we don't really hear about that. We just hear that, oh, the pilgrims came and they stepped ashore on Plymouth Rock in Plymouth. So there's this whole mythology about what happened here. And I just encourage people to explore it a little more, because it's much, much more complex than that. Those were some of the artists that we drove into, and Joy Harjo, a Native American woman, was our poet laureate that year. So we read some of her poetry on that walk. And then walk 8 was kind of a culmination of everything, Truro into Provincetown. And we looked at issues of the LGBT community in Provincetown. We looked at censorship issues, artists and writers, and again, the Mayflower and the Pilgrims. So one of the people I love quoting here is the executive director of the Tennessee Williams Festival, David, and I'm blanking on his last name. Sorry, David. His quote is that it wasn't important that the Pilgrims came to Provincetown. What's important is that they left so that Provincetown could become kind of the full extent of itself, could explore any and all issues of identity and sexuality and art, etc., and music, none of which the Pilgrims, who were Puritans, would have allowed to be established in this part of Cape Cod. Oh, stop. There we go. Okay, what just happened here? That just interrupted my little presentation. All right, because we're at the end, I'm going to stop sharing. But I'll go back and tell just one or two more things about Provincetown. So for our Mayflower, let's go back to the Mayflower. They came here 400 years ago, the Pilgrims, about 100 them on the Mayflower. And this is a connection back to Brewster. So if we go back to think about all those sea captains in Brewster, many of them lived along the main street and Lower Road, and one of them on Lower Road Henry Sears founded the Pilgrims Club. And if you go down Lower Road today, you'll see the remnants of several of those original sporting, swimming, cultural clubs that were along Lower Road. Well, why he's important in the Pilgrim Club is that they merged with the Cape Cod Memorial Association to build the Provincetown Monument. The monument was built in 1907 to 1910 and dedicated, Teddy Roosevelt laid the cornerstone. If you think about what else was built in the early 1900s, across the South, across the Midwest, most of the monuments to the lost cause, to the Civil War, went up. The Daughters of the American Revolution were extremely active from about the 1890s to 1930s, putting up all of these monuments that continue to this day. And in the summer of 2020, many of them were being targeted because of all the murders that were going on of Black and brown people by the police. So if you look to Richmond, Virginia, all of those statues on Confederate Mile were targeted to come down. So I ask us to think about, for those of us living on Cape Cod, what is the real message that the Provincetown Monument gives to people of color, gives to our Wampanoag population about whose history is honored here? I look at it now differently from going on this walk. I've walked up those stairs 5 or 6 times. I have many photos of it from the last, 50 years of my life. But now I think of it as, this is really a monument that needs some discussion. What the context of this is, when it went up. When it also went up, there was a functioning chapter of the KKK in Provincetown. The KKK had an active chapter on Cape Cod in the early 1900s. And when you think about what was going on in Provincetown at the turn of that century, they were active against the Portuguese, who were dark-skinned many of them from Portugal, and were Catholic. There was a cross burned on the Catholic church's lawn in Provincetown in the early 1900s. I knew none of that before I took this walk. So the last part of the slides let me try one more time just to see if I can get it quickly back. I don't think it's there. No, I'm sorry. So the last part of the experience I wanted to talk about was, so that was in 2020. And I had all this information and all these photos and questions to explore. So I decided to write a book, The Cape Cod Camino Way, about the experience. And what I did was I went to Florida for the winter and did the writing. And then on my way back, it was this April of 21. We were just starting to have vaccinations available. I did a 2-week civil rights, Civil War tour starting in Mobile, Alabama, and going through really the heart of the Confederacy. And what I realized was that needed to be the last chapter of my book, because what happened was I started looking at everything differently because of the experience I just had. So I went through Chattanooga, Tennessee, and looked at the history there. I went through Birmingham and Montgomery, and I went to the museums that were there. I walked the same streets that the protests happened on. I took a look at the Black History Trail in Mobile, Alabama, and it was an amazing compilation of both historical and contemporary people, places, and stories in Mobile, Alabama. I came up through the backbone of North Carolina and Virginia, and what I found were Confederate statues thrown behind the main administration building at the Virginia Military Institute. They had taken down Stonewall Jackson, and it looked like they didn't know what to do with them, so they threw them in the grass behind the building. And then I went to Gettysburg, and actually before Gettysburg, Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. If you've never been, please go. It's such an amazing story of that battle, really, about the institution of slavery in this country. But what is also important at Harper's Ferry is if you walk up above the historical town, is Storer College, Storer. And if you Google it, it was one of the first institutions in this country that admitted African Americans. I've worked in higher ed for almost 40 years. I had never heard of Storer College. So I explored that area for my afternoon. And then I went to Gettysburg. And if you've been to Gettysburg, you know that there's eons, so many different monuments and battlefields there to explore. And so I asked my Airbnb host, is there anything that honors the experience of the men who fought for the Union who were Black? And she said, oh my God, my husband will take you there. There's a Black cemetery located next to the ER room at the main hospital in Gettysburg that only house in the ground are the graves of 30 or 40 Black soldiers who fought with the Union Army. And I was sad to see that because it looked like it was not taken care of appropriately like these other monuments. But I was also proud that it was there to honor their experience. And then I came back and I said, okay, what do I do with all of this now? And so I decided that part of my mission in life needed to connect this to contemporary issues going on in our society. And this is where I'll just say, if we were on a walk today doing this, I would have to weave in what just happened in a New York City courtroom and say that the former President Trump was just convicted of however many counts he was charged with. And what does that mean to us now, today? How is that going to affect our elections or not? And let's explore it. Was there any other time in our democracy when this came up and we were so polarized and in such a difficult situation? And so I just want to leave us with that thought, because this experience I just took you on for the last about 35 minutes, 30 minutes was virtual. And I'd like to ask you to just give a comment. Did you learn something maybe you didn't know about that you want to go and explore more of? Or do you have any comments or questions for me? So I'm going to open it up for any conversation at this point. And just either raise your hand visually or unmute yourself and come in. will help you that way.
You can also type in the chat box if you're not comfortable speaking up. I can do that for you.
Thank you.
I only moved to the Cape about 2.5 years ago, so I definitely learned a lot. Yeah, and I've heard about your Camino Way. Certainly it's become very big, but looping it into other parts of the US. And I don't think I've seen the Provincetown Monument yet. Like I've been up there, but it was so wild and I couldn't find parking. But yeah, I'll definitely have to take a look at that now. It does put things into perspective.
Yeah, and I'll give the Provincetown Monument Museum credit for, they have a new exhibit done by a Wampanoag person on the Native American experience. And many of our historical societies, Wellfleet, the Brewster, the Atwood, they all are incorporating more stories, more artifacts, and exploring this part of the history that we just need to know about. I'll mention a quote. I had the opportunity in my higher ed career to meet Archbishop Desmond Tutu from South Africa. He spoke at one of our commencements at Chapel Hill. And I'll never forget what he said to the students. He said, until you fully confront your history, you will be unable to move forward into the future. And that has stuck with, that was over 12 or 14 years ago. And that's part of what I believe that we need to be doing as a country. And right here on Cape Cod. And another comment or question?
Can I say something?
Sure.
Oh, hi. I'm a 10th generation Cape Codder, fourth or fifth generation in the same neighborhood in Brewster. And I always find this really fascinating because we're raised on the myth and it kind of makes me angry. We never grew up with more of the truth or more of the complexity. It's just, as you say, if you go through the graveyard behind the UU church, you see a whole bunch of evidence that sea captains were in parts of the world where there were slaves because of where they died. And I think, well, how does a town this small not ever discuss that? So it's more commentary and just saying, I'm really glad you're doing this work.
Well, thank you. And I think there is a lot of good work being done now. The UU Church itself had a reparations task force exploring their history, and the Historical Society. I'll also point out another group, the Atlantic Black Box.
Yeah, I follow them.
Yeah, and the work Meadow Dibble is doing
Mhm.
up in Maine. It's just fascinating, some of the things that they've been uncovering in our connections. And I didn't tell the story of the salt cod, but that's a basic one too, is that's how we supported the West Indies, the plantations in the Caribbean. We dried our codfish and sent it there because it was cheaper for the owners, the plantation owners, to buy the codfish as a source of protein and use all the land on the Caribbean islands to grow sugarcane. They didn't want to grow their own crops or keep many cattle and all of that. And so again, like we were involved in that process, the people who were on the ships and dried the codfish, and that was women and children who were put into that process too. So everybody was tied up in it.
Yeah.
And I think that makes it become more normalized and kind of just like, well, that's our own little secret. We're just not going to talk about that too much. Because it makes us, like you said, angry, sad, some form of shame. And that's what we have to get through. That's what we have to grapple with. And I just encourage all of you to keep exploring, keep finding out these stories that are just amazing. Oh, let me tell you one more from the Kennedy's family. That's kind of fascinating because we only think of Jackie Kennedy as Jackie Bouvier, this beautiful adornment in the White House. And what is she most known for? Redoing the White House. Jackie Kennedy was part of a group of women chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt that was run out of the White House that invited Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring, who then went on to become the basis for the founding of the EPA. So Jackie Kennedy basically ran a female brain trust out of the White House in 1960. And we've never thought of her as anything beyond an adornment. But Jackie Kennedy, as well as Rachel Carson, helped convince President Kennedy to move forward on things like the nuclear test ban treaties, and looking at chemicals and starting the beginnings of the EPA. It was actually Nixon, I believe, who established the EPA. Might have been Johnson. One or two more final comments or thoughts or places I should go check out that you know about.
Hi, I enjoyed this a lot. It was very interesting and informative. Do you do sort of an organized walk throughout the year, or was this just this one thing in 2020 that you did?
Sure, thank you for asking. So no, I still do walks and I put them in the chat. You can also go to the website, Cape Cod Camino Way, and find out current. So basically for this summer, July and August, every Wednesday at 10:30, I'll be walking from the JFK Museum in Hyannis.
Mm-hmm.
And on Thursday at 4 will be Brewster, starting in the UU Church Cemetery.
Okay.
And the library is sponsoring a walk related to what we just did, but focusing on Brewster on Saturday, June 28th.
Oh,
And you can sign up through the library there. So yeah, please come join me on a walk. It's really interesting. People interact with each other. You learn stories from each other. That is very helpful.
Peggy, I just want to say what I find wonderful about this is that people are able to really just exchange ideas. I think part of the challenge, especially given where we're living now in the country, is that people feel like they have to pick a side. And I think what's wonderful about this is that you get to have a conversation and hear others' perspectives and also learn about the history, because I think the history, as you have said, is important. And it's not about making anyone feel guilty. It's just having the knowledge so you can make a choice.
Right. Thank you, Tony. That brings up an interesting conversation I had last year with one of the walkers. He was a hockey coach from one of the colleges in New York who has a Native American mascot. And so we were talking about mascots. And I said, well, right here, the Barnstable High School used to be the Barnstable Red Raiders. And that was very difficult to move through and change. But by discussing it, exploring it, where does that come from? Why do we still use that term? People were able to understand that it needed to change. And so I think he and I came to an agreement about maybe he needs to explore why they're still using that mascot at his college. He hadn't thought about that before. Yeah, so some progress. It's all a process, I feel. And so if we can work through the tension, the stress of acknowledging it, and then say, well, is there a different way? Like, is there a different way for us to learn about women scientists who've been our scientists that we just don't know about? That would really be exciting. And one I'll share with you. So we mentioned Rachel Carson and her statues over in Woods Hole. Another scientist, if you have not read the book by Robin Wall Kimmerer, Kimmerer. I see Devin clapping. I'm blanking on the name of it though. Sweetgrass, braiding sweetgrass. She's a brilliant scientist who's also a Native American, and she looks at all issues from thank you, braiding sweetgrass. It's spectacular as a read. I guarantee you'll enjoy it. And we'll end up giving it to other people to read. Okay, anyone want to make a final comment and then I'll close up?
Peggy,
Yeah.
on 2 levels, I've enjoyed the talk. One, for the information you impart, but on the second level, I wanted to say to you, you're like a pebble making ripples, but you're not. You're like a boulder making seismic waves. And anyone who spent the last 35 or 40 minutes with you could take so many different paths to explore. I want to just thank you for sharing your research with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Well, that's part of my life purpose, I guess, is that I'm an educator at heart. So to continue my own process of educating and deepening my awareness in what I don't know and how I've been complicit in repeating some of these mistakes and transgressions. And this is a way for me at this chapter of my life and career to give back. So I encourage you all to continue to explore in your own way through looking at it, through the material at our historical societies, our public libraries like Brewster, and the work Devin's doing is amazing. And if you get the chance, come on a walk, or if not, buy the book. It's at the Brewster Bookstore, the Brewster General Store, a few other places on the Cape, or just drop me an email. My email's in the chat, and tell me what you're doing this summer to keep learning. So keep walking, keep learning. Thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you, Peggy. Thanks everyone for joining us.